This is the story of a moment where a bully's cruelty collided with a hidden truth, and the entire world of Westwood High tilted on its axis. It all started with a ponytail, a smug grin, and a pair of handcuffs that were meant for the wrong person. If you've ever felt like the world is unfair, like the bullies always win, stick around, because this story is for you. And while you're here, make sure to subscribe. What you're about to see is a roller coaster you won't want to ride alone. The hallway was a river of denim jackets, backpacks, and the low, constant hum of 100 different conversations. It was the first week of school at Westwood High, a place where the social hierarchy was as rigid and unyielding as the concrete blocks of its mid-century architecture. And at the very top of that food chain, preening in a varsity jacket the color of a smug, cloudless sky, was Jason Thorne. He was the kind of rich that wasn't just about money, it was about legacy, a deep, seated belief that the world existed for his convenience. His father owned half the commercial real estate in the county, his mother chaired every important charity gala, and Jason carried himself with the unshakable confidence of someone who had never, ever been told no. And then, there was Elara. She was the new current in this stagnant water, a transfer student from the city who carried herself with a quiet, observant grace that immediately set her apart. She wasn't trying to be aloof. She was just trying to get to her next class, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her dark hair pulled back into a simple, practical ponytail. She moved through the chaos of the hallway like a ghost, unseen and unbothered. Or so she thought. Jason Thorne saw her. Of course he did. He saw everything that was different, everything that didn't fit neatly into his predefined boxes. He was holding court by a bank of lockers, his sycophants laughing a little too loudly at a joke he hadn't even finished. His eyes, pale and calculating, locked onto Elara as she tried to slip past. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. Here was something new to break. "Hey, new girl," he called out, his voice cutting through the din. The kids around him fell silent, sensing the shift in the air, the promise of spectacle. Elara paused, turning slightly, her expression neutral but her eyes wary. She'd met Jasons before, in different schools, in different cities. They were a universal constant, like gravity. "I'm talking to you," Jason said, stepping forward, effectively blocking her path. "We don't just ignore people here. It's rude." The irony was as thick as the cheap cologne he wore. He reached out, not to touch her shoulder, not to tap her arm, but to grab the end of her ponytail. His fingers closed around it, and with a sharp, vicious yank, he pulled her head back. A gasp, sharp and involuntary, ripped from Elara's throat. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock and pain. Her books clattered to the linoleum floor. The entire section of the hallway went dead silent. All that could be heard was the ragged echo of her cry and the distant, tinny beat of someone's headphones. She was on her knees, one hand flying to her stinging scalp, her eyes wide with a mixture of humiliation and fury. She looked up at Jason, who was still grinning, still holding that single strand of her hair between his fingers like a trophy. "What's the matter?" he taunted, his voice dripping with Fox concern. "Can't you take a joke?" Before Elara could even find the words, before she could push herself up from the cold floor, Jason's expression shifted. The grin didn't leave, but it hardened, turning into something colder, more calculated. He saw the defiance in her eyes, the refusal to cry. And that he could not abide. He took a step back, his performance for the audience now beginning in earnest. "Whoa, easy there," he said, raising his hands in a mock surrender. "You're awfully aggressive. I was just being friendly." He then turned his head, his voice rising to a panicked shout that was utterly, transparently false. "Officers! Hey, we need some help over here." From the far end of the hallway, two figures in uniform began to make their way through the parted sea of students. Officers Miller and Davison, the school resource officers. They weren't bad men, not in the grand scheme of things, but they were lazy. They'd been at Westwood for years, and their primary strategy for maintaining order was to appease the loudest, most influential voice. And the loudest voice, for the past 3 years, had always been Jason Thorne's. "What seems to be the problem, Jason?" Officer Miller asked, his hand resting casually on his belt, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He saw a disheveled girl on her knees in a calm, concerned-looking star athlete. The math in his mind was simple. "She just freaked out on me, sir," Jason said, his voice the picture of wounded innocence. I said hello, and she just started swinging. I was defending myself. A few of his friends, eager to stay in his good graces, mumbled their agreement. Yeah, she came at him out of nowhere. He was just trying to be nice. Elara finally found her voice, scrambling to her feet. That's a lie! He pulled my hair! He yanked me to the ground! Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with a raw, righteous anger. She looked from Officer Miller to Officer Davison, pleading for someone to see the truth. He assaulted me. Officer Davison sighed a long, suffering sound. He'd seen these, she said, dramas before. They were messy, they involved paperwork, and they almost always ended with the path of least resistance. Jason's father was a powerful man. This new girl, who was she, nobody? Son, is that true? Miller asked Jason, though the question was perfunctory. The tone suggested he already had his answer. No, sir, Jason said, looking the officer directly in the eye. I think she's unstable. Maybe she has problems. She could be dangerous. He infused the last word with just enough fear to make it believable. That was the trigger. The word dangerous changed the calculus entirely. It moved the situation from a schoolyard dispute to a potential threat. Officer Miller's posture straightened. He exchanged a quick, knowing glance with his partner. All right, miss, Officer Miller said, his voice taking on a formal, cold edge. We're going to have to detain you until we can sort this out. For everyone's safety. Elara's eyes widened in disbelief. What? No, you can't be serious. He's lying. Look at me. But they weren't looking at her. They were looking at the script Jason had written, and they were following it to the letter. Officer Davison pulled a pair of cold, steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clack as he unfolded them was the loudest sound in the hallway. It was a sound that sucked all the air out of the space, a sound that meant business, a sound of finality. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, Davison instructed, his voice devoid of all emotion. A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the student body. This had escalated beyond a simple bullying incident. This was an institutional endorsement of that bullying. This was the system in the form of two armed men siding with the bully. No, Elara whispered, her voice cracking. Please, don't do this. But they did. As she stood there, frozen in a nightmare, Officer Davison took her wrists, gentle, surprisingly, but with an unyielding firmness, and snapped the cuffs into place. The cold metal bit into her skin. The weight of them was immense, not just physical but symbolic. It was the weight of injustice. She hung her head, her ponytail, the very thing that had started this, now dangling as a pathetic reminder of her powerlessness. A single, hot tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek and fell onto the dull gray metal of the handcuff. Jason watched, his arms crossed, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. This was better than he could have possibly imagined. He hadn't just humiliated her, he had her officially branded as a problem. He had proven for all to see that his word was law. He was untouchable. What he didn't see, what no one saw, was the subtle shift in Elara's posture. The moment the cuffs locked, the initial shock and humiliation began to recede, burned away by a cold, focused fire. The tears stopped. Her breathing, which had been ragged, evened out. She didn't struggle. She didn't plead. She simply stood there, a statue of quiet dignity in the midst of the chaos she had not created. She turned her head, just slightly, and her eyes met Jason's. There was no hate in them, no fear. There was only a promise. A silent, terrifying promise that this was not over. The officers led her away, down the long hallway, past a gallery of stunned and silent faces. The story for everyone present was over. Jason had won. But the real story, the one that mattered, was just beginning. Later that day in the sterile, windowless confines of the principal's office, the official narrative was being firmly cemented. Principal Albright, a man whose primary talent was managing upwards and appeasing wealthy donors, listened to Officers Miller and Davison recount their version of events. Jason sat in a plush chair, the picture of contrite concern. It's a shame, really, Jason said, shaking his head. I just hope she gets the help she needs. Principal Albright nodded sympathetically. We'll be contacting her parents, of course. We have a zero-tolerance policy for violence, Jason. You can rest assured of that. At that moment, the door to the office opened. Elara was there, the handcuffs finally removed, but the faint red marks still visible on her wrists. She was no longer alone. Flanking her was a woman whose presence seemed to change the very pressure in the room. She was tall, elegant, and dressed in a severe, impeccably tailored pantsuit. Her hair was pulled back in a style not unlike her daughter's, but on her, it looked like a crown. Her eyes, the same shade as Elara's, swept across the room, taking in the principal, the officers, and Jason with a single, dispassionate glance that seemed to strip them all down to their constituent parts. This was Isabella Rossi Valentine, and she was a federal judge. Principal Albright, she said, her voice calm, low, and laced with a quiet authority that demanded immediate attention. I am Judge Rossi Valentine. This is my daughter, Elara. I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding. The color drained from Principal Albright's face. He knew the name. Everyone in the legal and political circles of the state knew the name. Judge Rossi Valentine was famously tough, fiercely intelligent, and had a reputation for eviscerating anyone who wasted her time or abused their power. She was, in many ways, the antithesis of everything this room represented in that moment. Why, Your Honor? Principal Albright stammered, rising from his chair. This is a surprise. We were just about to call. I'm sure you were, she said, her gaze now settling on Jason, who for the first time looked genuinely unnerved. The woman's stare was like being X-rayed. Now, my daughter has told me a story. I would very much like to hear yours. What followed was a masterclass in controlled intellectual demolition. The judge didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply asked questions. Precise, surgical questions. Officer Miller, she began, turning her gaze to him. You placed my minor daughter in handcuffs. On what specific articulable evidence of a crime being committed? Miller shifted uncomfortably. Well, ma'am, Your Honor, we had a complaint of assault from a credible witness, a single witness. She interrupted, her tone politely curious. The alleged victim of the assault. You didn't think to interview any of the 24 other students standing nearby. You didn't think to check the hallway security cameras, which I presume are installed for exactly this sort of incident. Miller opened his mouth, then closed it. Davison studied the floor as if the pattern in the tile held the secrets of the universe. She turned to Principal Albright. Principal, does your zero-tolerance policy for violence extend to students who initiate physical contact by yanking the hair of other students so hard it forces them to their knees? Or does that policy only apply after the victim reacts to their assailant? Principal Albright began to sweat. Well, of course, we investigate all sides. Really, Judge Rossi Valentine said, a faint, cold smile touching her lips. It seems to me you only investigated one side. The side belonging to the son of Robert Thorne. She let that hang in the air. She knew. Of course she knew. Finally, she looked at Jason. He had shrunk in his chair, the varsity jacket suddenly looking like a costume. Young man, she said, her voice deceptively soft. You called the police on my daughter. You accused her of a crime. Do you know what the legal term for making a false report to law enforcement is? Jason just stared, mute with terror. It's a crime, she answered for him, and falsely accusing someone of assault, with the intent to have them arrested and charged, that moves into the realm of something even more serious. It's called malicious prosecution. It's a felony. The word felony landed in the small room like a bomb. Jason's bravado was gone, replaced by the pale, trembling visage of a boy who was finally, truly, understanding the consequences of his actions. Now, the judge said, turning back to the adults in the room, we have several paths forward. The easy path, which you seem to prefer, involves sweeping this under the rug. That is not an option. The other path involves me filing formal complaints with the school board, the police department's internal affairs division, and a civil lawsuit against the school district, the police department, and the Thorne family for gross negligence, violation of my daughter's civil rights, and emotional distress. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Or, she said, you can handle this, right now, properly. And handle it they did. The following days were a seismic shift in the landscape of Westwood High. Jason Thorne was not just suspended, he was expelled. The school board, terrified of the lawsuit and the scandal, voted unanimously. His acceptance to the state university was rescinded. The varsity jacket was taken away, his name stripped from the team roster as if he had never existed. Officers Miller and Davison were placed on administrative leave pending a full review and were eventually reassigned to desk duty, far from any school. A mandatory, district-wide training program on de-escalation, implicit bias, and proper procedure was implemented, with Judge Rossi, Valentine personally approving the curriculum. But the true reckoning happened in the courtroom. The Thorns, used to buying their way out of trouble, found their checkbook was useless against a federal judge. Jason was charged as a juvenile with filing a false police report and assault. He was sentenced to community service, 200 hours at a community legal aid clinic, helping the very people his family had spent a lifetime looking down upon. He was also required to write a formal, public letter of apology to Elara, to be read aloud in the same school auditorium where he had once been celebrated as a hero. The day he read that letter was the final act of the drama. The auditorium was packed. Jason, looking smaller and older without his jacket, stood at the podium, his voice shaking as he confessed to his lies, his bullying, and his unearned privilege. He apologized to Elara, who sat in the front row next to her mother. Elara listened, her face serene. She didn't smile in victory. She didn't gloat. She simply absorbed his words, her own quiet dignity, the most powerful rebuttal imaginable. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, Judge Rossi, Valentine, who had been observing from the side, stood and walked to the podium. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice carried to every corner of the room. Power, she said, is not a weapon to be used against the weak. Privilege is not a shield to protect you from the consequences of your actions. Justice is not a convenience for the few. It is a right for all. What happened here was a failure on many levels. But it has also been a lesson I hope every single one of you remembers. Let this be a reminder that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Sometimes, it just needs a little push. She looked at her daughter, and a genuine, proud smile finally broke through her stern demeanor. Elara smiled back. It was over. The story of the racist bully who called the police on the new girl, not knowing she was the judge's daughter, became legend. It was a story about the abuse of power and the power of true justice. It was a story about a quiet girl who carried a hidden strength, and a mother who would move heaven and earth to protect her child and defend what was right. It was a story that proved that no one, no matter how rich or how connected, is truly above the law. And as for Elara, she finished the school year at Westwood. She was never bullied again. In fact, she found a new confidence, a strength forged in the fire of that terrible day. She had seen the system at its worst, and then she had seen her mother, a living embodiment of that same system, hold it accountable. She learned that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and that sometimes the greatest power lies not in fighting back with fists or fury, but with truth, with integrity, and with the unwavering knowledge of who you are. So, as this story comes to a close, we'd love to hear from you. From which part of the country are you watching this video? Leave a comment below and let us know. Your stories are what make this community so powerful.